The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
Saying sorry for a sad chapter in Canadian history.
I woke up with hundreds of total strangers, my size, my age, not knowing, what are they doing with all of us here?
On News and Review today, Canada's residential school apology. Hello, I'm Carla Robinson. This summer, the House of Commons in Ottawa was the scene of an historic apology. It was an emotional moment as Native leaders mingled with politicians and tears flowed freely, and the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, rose to apologize to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada.
The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
The Prime Minister was apologizing for the pain and anguish caused by Canada's residential school system. Starting in the 19th century, more than 150,000 Native children were removed from their homes and communities and forced to attend these mainly church-run, government-funded schools. The plan was to assimilate Natives into mainstream Canadian society by adopting Christianity, speaking English or French, and turning their backs on their own culture. And it exacted a terrible price. Separated from their parents and stripped of their identity, many Native children suffered terribly. And to make matters even worse, many were subjected to horrible physical and sexual abuse. It was an abuse that would not only poison the lives of those children, but one that in many cases would also affect the lives of their kids. In a moment, we'll return to that historic apology in the House of Commons. But first, we're going to meet some of the people who attended residential schools and hear how that legacy of pain was passed down from generation to generation.
My name is Alice Little Deer. I'm 78 years old. I spent about 8 years in residential school.
My name is Raymond Mason. I'm 62 years old, and I attended residential school for 12 years.
I'm Madeline Dion Stout. I'm 62 years old. I'm from the Kihiwan First Nation in Alberta. I attended Blue Quills Residential School for 36 consecutive months. That would be 3 years.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
I remember them taking me away from my mother and my stepfather. And I can hear them telling my mom that that was the best thing for me, and that not to worry, I would be looked after.
Our parents didn't want to worry us unduly and tell us and warn us that we are going to be separated for a long, long time with barely a visit.
I see him come around, Indian agent in a boat, with the principal, then collect some children from the reserve. Mm-hmm. Then he would come back again, come and take some more.
So the next day, I woke up with hundreds of total strangers, my size, my age, and not knowing, what are they doing with all of us here? Why are there's so many of us here, and that's where a lot of my whole life really started to change, because I got strapped, I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched,
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6. I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter is dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
Their education must consist not merely training of the mind, but of a weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors and the acquirements of the language, art, and customs of civilized life. Edgerton Ryerson, 1847 Report for Indian Affairs.
Visits from my parents were very rare, but I do recall one visit when my mother and father came, and I remember specifically my mother's red tam, that splash of color. I remember her getting out of the wagon, and I was crying already watching them because I was missing them already. They hadn't even walked through the door yet of the residential school, but I was missing them already. And when they were actually leaving, I cried until my nose bled.
Tell me how you felt when you saw your children go to that school.
Well, I felt sad. My first 2 boys went. And then a couple of years after, the next 2 boys went. And so on, as they got older, yeah. I told them to be strong. I had always told them to be strong, to be able to take it like the other children.
Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. Nicholas Flood David Report, 1879.
There are 3 reasons why I think residential schools are a blot on the Canadian landscape. One is that we became strangers in our home and native land. 2 is that nurturing relationships between parents and children were severed. Residential schools were a frontal attack on parenthood. 3 is that it added to our mental stress in a very real way.
My name is Michael Loft. I'm from Ganawagi. I'm 55 years old, okay, and my dad attended residential school for 11 continuous years in Spanish, Ontario.
My name's Lorena Fontaine. I'm 38 years old, and both my parents and grandparents went to residential school. I was at a conference that my mom was speaking at. She was giving the keynote address, and she started talking about her residential school experience during her speech. And and that's how I found out. Well, I was, of course, I was shocked and appalled, and I just felt so terrible for her. I felt frozen when I was listening to her. And it wasn't until after she finished speaking that I started thinking about our family life. I started thinking about the abuse that was very prevalent when I was a child. And I started putting connections together. I was raised by parents who never had a childhood, and they didn't have any parents as role models. So we were vulnerable children. And a lot of us were abused ourselves as young children. And I also realized at that point that one of the people who abused me in my family had been a residential school survivor, a family member. And I understood why now, why I was abused.
He got out, you know, like everybody gets out at 16, and he eventually made his way to Aguizasne, to his home, and he told me that he couldn't connect with them. He couldn't connect because he couldn't speak the language. He didn't understand the culture. So he couldn't take it, you know. He was frustrated. He was going nowhere. So he went back to the residential school for one more year because it seemed like that was home now. That was home. And that's where he could, you know, they spoke his language, and so that's where he went.
I grew up not knowing my language, and in fact, I kind of felt a bit ashamed about our language and our identity because it seemed like they were, meaning my parents and my aunts and uncles, were ashamed too in some way because they didn't want to talk about it and they didn't want to share with us about who we were.
Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, January 1st, 1920.
Generally, the survivors of residential school do not commit suicide any more than the general population. Okay. It's the children of the residential school survivors who commit suicide in incredibly high numbers. You know, 6 to 7 times, you know, the provincial average. Okay.
It might just take one person to start talking about it, or perhaps a family to start talking about the fact that there is abuse, and the reason why there's that abuse is because of the residential school experience. That, you know, we're not abusive people by trade. We're not, we weren't born that way. And to be able to, I think families need to be able to realize that they're not alone, that none of us are alone anymore, that we have each other, and that it's okay to start talking about it.
In recent years, the federal government has been taking steps to make up for that sad chapter in Canada's history. In 2005, it set up a $2 billion compensation package for former residential school students. And earlier this year, the government announced it was setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But for many of the estimated 90,000 former students, the most moving moment came when the Prime Minister apologized to them in the House of Commons. The CBC's Keith Bogue was there and filed this report.
Imagine the complicated feelings of Chief Phil Fontaine as he headed a procession of Native leaders into the very House of Commons that, for generations, had actively sustained the residential school system that did so much harm to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, including himself. From the public galleries packed with Native people, liveliness and noise, accompanied by a very loud drum beat, set a tone that was celebratory and proudly defiant. Finally, with the members in their places, the Prime Minister took the floor and the audience quieted to listen. From inside the House, from the lawn in front of Parliament, in a New Brunswick classroom, a Native Centre in St. John's, and a gymnasium in Vancouver. They heard the Prime Minister describe a system deliberately designed to take the Indian out of Native children and assimilate them into the dominant culture.
It was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions.
Not only were the policies wrong, said Harper, the personal conduct of those in authority at the schools was frequently criminal.
We now recognize that far too often these institutions gave rise to abuse or neglect and were inadequately controlled. And we apologize for failing to protect you.
There was more, and it led inevitably to this.
The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
Harper spoke for the Government of Canada, but when Stéphane Dion stood up, he added the unexpected grace note of emphasizing the particular responsibility of his own party.
As the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, a party that was in government for more than 70 years in the 20th century, I acknowledge our role and our shared responsibility in this tragedy.
For Native leaders in the House of Commons, it was a proud moment, a day of victory after a long and painful struggle, the closing of one chapter and the beginning of a new and hopefully happier one. The CBC's Susan Bonner has that story.
Call upon Phil Fontaine, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nation.
In a day of firsts, this was a standout. Aboriginal leaders speaking to Canada from the floor of the country's parliament. It almost didn't happen.
This day testifies to nothing less than the achievement of the impossible. We heard Canada say it is sorry.
They welcomed this as a day of reckoning for people the Grand Chief called the essence of Canada. Hope was heard here too, like never before.
We still have to struggle, but now we are in this together. I reach out to all Canadians.
But I'm proud to be an Aboriginal Canadian, Miigwech.
In ancient languages.
I have to face you to say this.
And face to face, leaders to leaders.
I stand here today ready to work with you, as Inuit have always done, to craft new solutions and new arrangements based on mutual respect and mutual responsibility.
Inside this chamber today, respect reigned. Outside, some regret tainted the triumph of finally hearing an apology.
My parents didn't hear an explanation why their tradition, their language, their culture, their lifestyle, their knowledge of the land and the language was not good enough for the government. That's my regret.
But there was much gratitude as well.
The beginning of healing.
It's a long time in coming.
From those who chose to be here as unofficial witnesses, and those invited guests who sat through ceremonies, to the oldest living survivor of a residential school.
Marguerite Webinar.
Today was all about witnessing an apology, signed, sealed, and delivered to the First Nations of a country that did them wrong. Susan Bonner, CBC News, Ottawa.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which began work this summer, will give Aboriginal people a chance to share more of their stories with other Canadians so that more light can be thrown on a sad but significant part of our history, and the healing and the reconciliation can continue.